I've never been happier. These are the words of a young man at the end of his life. We all want to be happy. Let's look at that life now.
To go harpoon fishing, and he loved it. He would spend hours just like swimming around, like tennis, football, cricket, horse riding we did when we were really young.
He was also very good at ping pong. He was in the ping pong team in St. John Fishes. He very much liked just to be with people. He was someone who very much liked video games. He'd also had canaries, which he also bred. He had lovebirds.
He really liked fishing, playing chess. He was really into nature as well. He always had some weird pets. He was really into history, those kinds of things. He didn't have any sisters, but I was basically his sister. I really remember really vividly his laugh.
He knew how to enjoy himself, despite the difficulties of being ill.
There's been an issue in my life that I had depression. Pedrito's life and my family's life has suffered with my changing in moods. Being around, so it's like Dick Turpin, you know, you disappear.
One time you would be very angry and very annoyed towards my dad. But at the same time you don't understand the illness. We didn't understand it, at least I still don't understand it. It's a very difficult mental illness.
I knew I was damaging Pedrito when I was not well, because he wouldn't understand my reactions. But then as he grew older, when I finally got diagnosed and treated, then he started looking after me. And he would come to my room where I was in bed, and I said, "How are you doing? Do you need anything?" And he would sit with me, and we had a chat.
We've changed a lot of schools. So we've changed, I think, 5 or 6 times schools, 5 or 6 times home.
It was very difficult for him to move. He was breaking his friendship.
He was starting secondary school. He said, well, there's a boy in the class, he's not treating me well. We talk about, well, you carry on with who you are, don't worry too much. And he just carry on. And then one day, the tutor decided to move him form because that was going to be better. And later on, we learned that that boy was like taking his lunch and throwing it away.
Look at that.
Pedro Ballester.
Interesting. Holmes, look! There's blood here. It's definitely from a different person. We should take it back to the lab. I agree with you.
After Manchester, we lived in Harrogate for 5 years, and during that time we would still go to the boys' club. Greygarth Boys Club is an Opus Dei boys' club where we would receive like Christian formation and we'd do activities. It was a bit of a trek, it was quite far away, yeah, it was like 70 miles.
And they're off. We see Mr. Albert Tardy, this year's favourite. François Escargot and Mr. Anonymous, all of whom are very slow and well, never seen this man win. Lead there, and who's the slowest? Tardy!
And so, Mr. Tardy, another resounding victory for you in your Olympic training. What exactly is your secret?
My secret, well, is steroids, of course. Oh, sorry, no, it's his training, a lot of work, and also good diet.
5 years later, Pedro and the family moved to Huddersfield. They spent a short time in Mallorca.
If you keep on moving, you don't have time to develop those very deep friendships. So then we moved to Spain, and in 4 months, loads of friends. And one time he escaped from school, and he went to visit a castle with his friends. And this idea, this is Pedro. This is, you know, this sort of adventurous with being with the guys and having fun and sports.
Honour and glory to the Revenge.
Honour and glory to the Revenge!
Our crew's a great one. Never in my life have I encountered such bravery and courage.
In Mallorca, I remember perfectly in the kitchen, and I was saying, Pedrito, I think it's better we go back to England, because the contract they wanted to offer him at the end is not possible, it's more stable in the UK, and will be good for all the family. And he looked at me, I think maybe he cried a bit in the sense of, you know, being with the head down, and he say, yeah, okay.
So it was a cross for him to come back from Spain. At the same time, he was already giving himself to God.
Started to realize that the people who would show interest in him, he would just give himself to them. He would just really, you know, love them.
Pedro volunteered first to Reach Out, which is this like a mentoring charity, and he would go on weekends, on Saturday mornings. He would also take a friend of his called David.
Well, he started bringing this friend of his who was a man, he was a very, very bright young person. He ended up going to Oxford. But he was somebody who was finding it difficult to make friends. And it is because of that he felt he had to reach out to him, and they became very good friends because of that.
He would often ask about what I like to do. Like, he was very interested in what I was doing. Obviously I was in his life as well, but I really liked going out. I liked, you know, having a drink, whatever. And he always said, you know, God can see you in all these situations. But he was never ever judgmental about it. He always said it in a really friendly way.
One time in the tennis court, so there was one person who, I think he was a bit crazy. I think he'd just come out of jail, he had a kid. He was like 20 something, Pedro was like, I don't know, 14, 15. So, you know, it was a bit alarming. When he wanted to play tennis, he saw us playing, and Pedro was very happy just to start talking to him. And then they started regularly playing tennis. Or then you had the neighbor, and he was very lonely as well. And then Pedro started saying, oh, Javi, why don't you go and go play with him a bit? Because I was the youngest, so there was a bit more age difference.
When we got to college, we became very close. He lived maybe 500 yards from the college. So my mum worked a similar distance away and would drop me in the mornings at his house. And I would have to bang on the door and get him up sometimes, because, you know, he was sometimes late, and you know, it was, and we would walk in together. And so we did that pretty much every morning, you know, for 2 years.
It was a geography trip to do some work on a field, and that was a weekend, and that included Sunday. And that school was not Christian or any denomination. And then he asked if he could go to the Sunday Mass. And the teacher said, well, there's a ratio between teachers and students, and we cannot break that for security reasons. It had to be a group of 6 to be able to, one teacher to go with you to church. But he was the only Catholic one, and he told his friends, and it was so nice to see that he had a group of friends that offered to go with him to Mass.
Went to a course with a number of young people, and he happened to be there. He came with a group from Manchester. He was really excited to hear stories about friendship, about how I had got to know the work, and indeed how I had developed a personal relationship with Christ. And so we had a number of conversations, and in one of those conversations I asked him, so Pedro, what about you, you know? What do you think God might be asking from you? He said, look, Pablo, don't worry. I've got it all sorted out. And then a couple of months later, he joined the work. He kind of wanted to see what God was asking from him, and so he started a period of discernment. One of the things that he was discerning was whether God was calling him to give his life fully to himself and others in the form of celibacy, apostolic celibacy. Which is one of the paths within Opus Dei. But certainly one thing that he was stuck in his mind is that if he were to join Opus Dei in this country, one big sacrifice would be whether he could go back to Spain. The amazing thing was that despite the fact that he was really in love with Spain, as soon as it clicked, that was it. He didn't talk anymore about going back to Spain, which was again the part of that spirit of sacrifice that he had, which was very unique to him. There was one time when Pedro and I were talking, and I had noticed that for some time that he was a lot happier, right? A lot more himself. And I thought, all right, I've got him, right? I know what he's going to tell me. He's got a girlfriend, because how can he be this happy? So then he said, Carlos, I need to tell you something. I said, okay, what's her name? And he said, no, it's not a her, it's something else. So then I said, okay, are you, because then I clocked, are you a Numeri? He said, yes, I'm a Numeri of Opus Dei. So yeah, that was very good.
It wasn't something I understood in the sense of I'd never heard of a Numeri before. So it probably reaffirmed to me his commitment to the religion that he had chosen. We had lots of conversations about why he had done this and what that meant. I always felt when I was talking to Pedro I was learning something, and I felt I was learning something then.
When I found out he was a Numeri, initially I was upset because I'm never going to see him, and our relationship is going to change. But then seeing him afterwards, it was like we were kind of closer than ever in a sense, because even though I didn't say anything about it, he was the one that kind of was reassuring, because I think he could see it. He was like, oh, you're my sister, you'll always be my sister. And also I'd never seen him happier. He was absolutely beaming. There was something about him, and I don't want to sound really cheesy or anything, but he had changed, I think.
He offered to do a group to go through the UCAT, and then this girl used to go. And one day I saw them just talking a bit longer. He already had seen his vocation as a Numeri, and then when he arrived, he just told me, well, we were talking about friendship and we were doing, and I explained to her my vocation, and then she said, oh, I knew it. It was too good to be true. And then he laughed, and he didn't take those things too seriously, but I could see his delicacy just talking to her. He considered her a friend and just being very natural.
He also made an effort to tame his character.
He was very focused, he was very logical, he was very pragmatic. This is what it is, and that's it.
He would always save everything, right? And he's like, oh, you have to eat it because we don't want to waste it, right? So it's a good thing, but maybe sometimes he would take it a bit too far. We would go to the McDonald's and take the ketchup home and stuff, and it's like, come on, Pedro.
Pedro applied to study chemical engineering at Imperial College London. He stayed at Netherhall House.
Looking forward to the challenge. Imperial College is the top college for his degree, for his subject it seems. So he was delighted, he got there.
At Netherhall, Pedro spent lots of time with people from all around the world. As a Numeri, he studied, prayed, and helped those around him.
He would very regularly just disappear, and you'd be like, where are you going? Off to the chapel, do you want to come say a rosary? And he'd always invite people. Pedro was always there to hold me accountable, and it used to really irritate me. So I used to get so angry because in Netherhall, Mass was really early, but breakfast was at 8. And so I'd be there for breakfast. And every morning, Pedro would sit in front of me and he'd be like, how come you can make it to breakfast but not to Mass? And so this genuine, just perpetual accountability was so important to my own growth. He was always fascinated by me because I had a Catholic mother and a Muslim father, and he was always trying to figure out how that worked.
I worked in the parish that's down the road from where he was living in Netherhall, and I was looking for catechists, people who would help teach the faith to young children in the parish. I said to them, I said, would you help at the parish? I know it's sacrificing your Sundays and there's things you'd probably rather be doing. And Pedro and a couple of other guys were very, very generous and said yes. He was always willing to come with a kind of cheerful smile to help. So I was always really impressed with his generosity of spirit.
There was one night we all decided, let's go out. And this wasn't something that we did a lot, but when we did, we'd usually drink quite a bit, and Pedro's here. And we had one of the best nights that I've ever had. We didn't drink loads, we weren't sort of being reckless, we went out and we hung out. It was amazing because you had all of these guys that maybe weren't coming from a point of view of a Catholic faith, maybe weren't coming from a point of view of, having necessarily too much of a moral compass. And you had Pedro as this incredible witness of somebody who just wanted to go out and just have a beer with his friends and have good conversation. And that's what we did.
Pedro was an intellect, but his communication skills were second to none. So when he was able to discuss his faith or challenge me, he did with an intellect. And in all my years, I've never come across that before. Did I find that difficult? Yes, I did. Because I look at myself in the mirror and think, wow, I'm having a conversation with someone I'm giving 30 years away to.
I was always interested in religion, but I had never been a religious person, and we often had conversations around religion and what religion meant to him and it had meant to me, and these types of things. I think the respect that was given from both of us, that we very much agreed to disagree on lots of things, but at the end of it, shake hands.
I wouldn't describe myself as a lapsed Catholic. I think particularly since I was married, you know, my faith got stronger and stronger and stronger, but then it was the question of, do you really listen? Do you really hear? Because he did. He rarely spoke about himself, but he listened, and he wanted you to open up.
At Netherhall, he started to feel the pain, though he didn't give much importance to it. He holidayed in Mallorca with his family, where the pain worsened. His father, being a surgeon, became more concerned.
He was walking and having some pain, and then is when we decided to have just an X-ray, and they could see like lesions that they had to be investigated.
They travelled back to Manchester, where they confirmed the diagnosis of cancer.
We came back on the 2nd of January straight to my hospital, so they could do an MRI, a CT scan. So finally we found out that he had osteosarcoma of the pelvis, a big tumor, so it was about 1.5 kilograms.
We had a meeting with the orthopedic surgeon. He asked about what the treatment was. It was explained to him. I just hugged him because that was the first time that we heard officially that he had the cancer. And then he just said, "Mom, I gave God my life with my vocation, and he gave his cross to his friends." Yeah, this is what he said, and then he had some medication to help him with the pain and went to sleep. And we just prayed next to him. But those words, I will never forget those words, because that was his reaction. Just, that was the moment that he learned that he had cancer.
He was a very cheerful guy and very positive, okay? But at the same time, he wasn't the guy who would like noise and big, you know, clapping. And one thing which he cringed at when he had the cancer, was announced he had cancer, there would be impromptu parties in the house, okay? And he would take it because that's what people wanted to give him, but, you know, he wouldn't be very keen on that kind of thing. He would be more at ease with, you know, quite very English kind of character in that sense.
He had to leave Netherhall and start treatment in Manchester.
He used to be connected to these tubes for his medicine, and he would call the stand his wife because he couldn't be separated from it. So that's an example. He would take things with a great sense of humor. So he lost a lot of weight. The doctors told him that they were going to have to give him food, and if he couldn't eat it, they'd have to insert him through a tube. So he didn't quite like that idea. When he came to taking his weight, he came into hospital, they put him on the scales, and the nurse said, "Oh, fantastic, you're well above the weight you need to be to avoid this tube being put into you." He said, "Oh, great, fantastic, I don't need this then." And he started getting stones out of his pockets.
When he first got diagnosed, he was given morphine, right? And we always joked like, "Oh guys, I'm on this thing, morphine, it's so good."
He started losing his hair, which obviously is a common thing and with certain chemotherapies that are given. And I think I was there actually, in the hospital the day that it was decided that enough was enough, we're probably going to shave the rest off and sort of be done with it. I seem to remember making some sort of, you know, rude joke about his hair and having a laugh about it with him.
Hello everyone at Netherhall. Thank you very much for the 2 videos you sent me. And I would just like to say to Bach that I'm already very much in touch with what Putin is doing, thanks to RT. And to John Scott that I miss his violin from the shows. And oh, by the way, Johnny, I live in Manchester now. We moved in June. And oh, Alvaro Pons, how's your bike riding skills, slipping on the ice and everything?
He's very quick to make friends because he was only one semester in Imperial College, and in that semester he managed to make a group of friends that came all the way from London to Manchester just to see him once he got diagnosed.
I was lucky enough to go with a very small group. We left at 4 in the morning, got a plane to go visit him in Heidelberg, and at that point he was, he'd lost all of his hair, looked very, very unwell. But there was still that joy that I knew about him. It was radiant.
He was always encouraging me to be the best version of myself and do everything to the best of my ability. And I didn't feel like I was doing that, and yet I saw this guy in front of me who still had the same zeal and the same joy about him that I knew when he was studying chemical engineering at Imperial College London and living his best life. And now I'm seeing this guy in a hospital bed who's not got much longer left. And I said to him, how do you still live that? Like, you can't be living that anymore, this idea of being the best that you can be. And he said, every opportunity you have, there's an opportunity to do it to the best of your ability. And he told me about his experience in the hospital and how important it was that he was the best patient he could be, and the best son he could be, and the best brother he could be.
On Wednesdays, you had pizza night. The Christie Hospital would give you free pizza for you and your family and friends. And it was funny because usually the patients ask for 1 pizza for their family or 2 if they bring a friend. I think Pedro asked for 10 pizzas because he brought 30 friends to come. And this would be like every week, it would be like 10 pizzas. And then he made very good friends with a guy called Tom Walker, who was a bit older than him, but very nice guy. If he knew Tom was in the Christie, he would go and visit, even if he didn't have to go.
I met Pedro in the parish church. I smiled at him and he smiled back. And his smile was so warm and generous. So that Saturday, that might be the second time I saw Pedro. I said, excuse me, my son is going to get confirmed on Wednesday next week. Could you be his sponsor, please? And he said, yes, of course.
He doesn't know that he's ill. It was so moving to see Pedrito's reaction, like so normal.
On Wednesday evening, that was my son's confirmation, and Pedro was there. It was just so beautiful.
Well, he was very weak that day, but he did it.
And I'm sure I could never find any more suitable sponsor than Pedro for my son.
When he was in hospital, there was a nurse on the ward who'd been going through a difficult time, and she was feeling down. Pedro entered a conversation with her and waited until he felt there was enough friendship. And he said, "Are you going to Mass?" And the nurse said, "No." And Pedro said, "That's why you're unhappy." And the nurse promised to begin to practice her faith again.
I arrived at the Christie one day and I walked into his room. I think I'd seen his dad, and his dad had said, "Just go in." And I walked in and there were 2 nuns sat there and they were 2 Peruvian nuns. And it was such an example to me of how far Pedro's reach was.
But is that putting things away from his state? I don't want to talk about my illness, I'm here. So how are you? You tell me.
He still managed to have energy to say, how is that particular thing which he had asked you the previous time going? So he had very specific things to say. Always very interested in your things, how is your job going? Have you managed to have the conversation with that colleague of yours about that difficult subject which we discussed last time? I was quite struck by this, and because I've been praying for it, he would say, that's been on my mind.
Will was a friend of Pedro. He was a patient in the hospital. They started talking about family and sport and even music, and then they moved into love. How much I remember Will talking about how much he loved his family, and then Pedrito was saying that then you know what that deep love is, and Will said, I know what love is. I said, well, that's God, and he said, then I know Him.
He always asked me about my family, so it was amazing how Despite his sufferings and all the worries that he had about hospital and whatnot, he was always able to kind of reach out to other people and ask them, you know, for their particular needs.
I remember coming back from Japan with a bottle of whiskey, and we shared a glass of whiskey together in Christie's. I had to really think about how I could talk about him rather than just about me.
And then I said, no, but tell me something you really like to do. Because other people like to go, I don't know, take a plane or go in a helicopter or go to Disneyland. And he looked at her and said, I want to see the Pope. So we managed to get the interview with the Pope, and we went there, and it was amazing. Pedro looked at him and he said, I'm a numero Opus Dei, I got cancer, and I offer all this for the church and for yourself. But it was with such a simplicity. The Pope looked at him with such a love. It's unbelievable. When they say that you see good people, and you could read the eyes, it's very true. The Pope looks at you with love. He also carried a letter of his friends and members of the staff from Christie's that had signed the letter. So he handed in the letter to the Pope. In my research, I found that carbon therapy and proton therapy could be an option for Pedro, and he opened up an opportunity to go to Heidelberg, because they say that they had people with the intention to treat this cancer, that they had very good outcomes. So they could call it curative treatment.
He asked me, do you think the miracle will happen? And I said, I'm praying for it. And he said, I'm not sure either. But if the miracle does happen, then this news about the funding is not so important. But if I die, then it's heaven. So it's a winning situation either way. He said this as if he was cracking a joke, with the greatest of smiles.
Soy Pedro y bueno, quiero decir muchas gracias por rezar por mí. Me han dicho que estoy rezando mucho. Y pues nada, mañana volamos a Alemania para empezar el tratamiento y estaré ahí hasta finales de julio. Y pues nada, rezar para que vaya todo bien. Hasta luego.
In May 2015, Pedro and his parents came to Germany. His situation was, of course, not easy, but he tried to live a normal life, I would say. He told me, bring me people, you know. I'm interested in meeting people. I'm interested in knowing more about Germany. Of course, we visited the city of Heidelberg. I brought him to Cologne to meet other young people. We went to a student's residence of Opus Dei there in Cologne. What I recognized, an intelligent young fellow, good-looking, open-minded, very interested, especially in my work. Are you traveling again to Pakistan soon? And so on. He was interested in it. How is the situation of Christians in Pakistan? And so on. These were the topics he was interested in. And you know, the treatment, the illness, the cancer was not a big topic. So, and then of course, after 2 months, I thought he's cured, or he will be cured soon. And it seemed to me that he was cured when he left the country.
And they could see that the cancer cells were not active anymore. So that was very hopeful. And in fact, he felt symptomatically much better.
Ok, entre los plásticos.
After treatment, Pedro fell into remission. He was able to start his studies again at the University of Manchester, staying at Greygarth.
His freedom. This is an 18-year-old kid that is having his life ahead of him again.
I was Pedro's academic advisor at the University of Manchester. And as a student, he was a very dedicated and hardworking student. He really took his studies very seriously. And he was very passionate about becoming a chemical engineer. I had Pedro and 4 other students, and they all became very, very close.
I started my studies at University of Manchester at the same time as he did. I think he had a gift for friendship, but nonetheless he was someone who tried very hard to get to know people.
From what I can recall, he was interested in all sorts of topics.
He had lots of cultural interests. He was able to enjoy the life that he had.
There was a French undergraduate student, a first year like himself, and this French lad was homesick after his first week in Manchester. And Pedro walked with him around the campus, and this boy told him his opinion that life was without purpose and ended in nothing. And he was sad. And Pedro asked him, "Do you believe in God?" And the boy said, "No." And Pedro said, "That's why you're unhappy." He thought that he'd been too direct, but later that boy looked at him again and clearly enjoyed his company, and they became friends.
Here he was the secretary of the residence from September, and he would suffer when he saw that residents didn't really make the most of the time at university, that they were, I don't know, very small things, yeah, but if he would ask sort of why is this resident not coming out of his room, not socializing with people and open, why is he a little bit selfish, or why is just little things that he'd pick up and thinking this person is not happy. Like, and he could, why not? That would hurt him. So we had to kick someone out of the residence. He was hurt.
So I remember once we were with a few friends together in a get-together, and someone brought a jamón, which is, you know, Spanish cured meat that we knew that Pedro really liked, and we passed it around, and he got to Pedro, and Pedro had a great elegance. So he took it. He was just talking away, and he just passed it around, you know. He didn't try it. But he did it in a way that, you know, I don't think many people noticed.
Everything was going fine until the pain returned. A doctor from Spain called Patricio moved to work at the Christie and stay at Greygarth.
And in January, he was supposed to take some exams, and he did take one, but by that time, then his pain sort of recurred.
He had the feeling that something was wrong, but nonetheless, he studied for the exams and went to all of them, even though he was clearly in pain.
Throughout the semester, I could see that his health was deteriorating. At some point, he started using crutches. He was given a special car so he could move around the campus and park anywhere. I saw him every week, and he never missed a tutorial. He never missed a lecture.
At the time, he had the scans. That was in February 2017. And then a few days later, he came to the consultation with his doctor at the Christie. He essentially told us that essentially the cancer had come back, and he said a few things. One thing is that it was incurable. The second thing was that he needed a second course of chemotherapy to try and control the growth and the spread of the cancer. Then Pedro asked directly, how long do I have left? And the doctor sort of predicted that there were like maybe perhaps 12 months.
And of course, we're all very upset. His mum was very upset. Pedro sort of half smiled and sort of said, "Oh dear." But that hit him hard. I don't think he was expecting it. In fact, afterwards, he didn't mention, well, yeah, I mean, I half smiled, but not to make my mum cry.
Yesterday I went to Dr. Leahy, and he told us straight off the bat that the cancer had grown 4 centimetres. Obviously, this was a bit of a shock, because obviously, you know, the cancer hadn't been doing anything since we finished a year and a half ago, so we just assumed that the cancer had died and whatever. So obviously my mum
well, we're all so shocked. It took my mum about 5 minutes to cry, and so yeah, I was lying down on the bed to keep the leg raised because it was still pretty swollen. Andy was there and Patricia was there, and they were pretty stunned as well. And I was just sat there, smiling. I don't know. Oh, and Kate was there, the liaison nurse. So yeah, so anyway. God's got more things in store for us. So yeah, so the doctor said that we need more scans. We need a CT, bone scan, the PET scan, and a load of other scans. So yeah, and then start chemo soon, different regime. Not as intense, it'll be 5 days in, and then 3 weeks off. So that's nice, so you get more holidays off. What else? Like, it was hard, well obviously it's hard for my mum, and then my dad took it quite well this time around. And Carl and Harry, and they found out later on in Greygarth. They found it quite tough. Harry didn't want to go with his friends to go to jump in the Trafford Centre. So yeah, so today, the day after, I'm getting loads of WhatsApps from everyone. It's like extra work. No, but I'm getting through them. No. Today I changed the fish tank water. Yeah, one of my little hobbies. A few things I still can do. Have pets. And so now I've just been off the phone talking to Laura, WhatsApps. She suggested I write a book. No way. Or a blog. No way. So I thought I'd do this video thing. You know, people can look after it and look at it, you know, after I die, you know, spares me the embarrassment. So anyway, so today's the first day. And I might not do it every day, but most days. So it goes.
I remember when I went to see him, I was always very, very upset, and I tried to hide it, but he could see it. He would always ask about me, he would always ask about what's going on in my life. My mum told me that he would always ask about me. He would always be, I'm worried about Carmen. And it's crazy because, you know, he was the one going through this terminal illness. He always had a smile on his face, even though he was in so much pain.
I think one of the consequences of the drugs was that they would make him drowsy. He would fall asleep very easily. We found out, because obviously he wouldn't tell us this, but we found out at some point that he would delay having the drugs if he knew there was people coming.
I remember in the hospital that when he was getting very weak, and I said, well, don't feel that you have to attend everybody. People will understand if you cannot see them. And he said, no, man, don't worry, you know, don't say no to anybody.
Towards the end of the year, one of his friends came to see me, and he had a message from Pedro saying that he was in hospital and he wanted me to know. That same day, I emailed the other students and I told them, this is what's happening. I'm going to the hospital tonight. If you want to come with me, meet me outside at 5, outside my office. They were there, all of them, at 5 o'clock, waiting for me. So we drove to the hospital to see Pedro. And you could tell he was genuinely happy to see us all. He was in very good spirits that day.
I went back to university inspired by Pedro because I'd had a conversation with him. I went to see him, and obviously, you know, I'm very much aware of the fact that he's not, you know, he might not be with us that much longer. So I want to talk about him. And as soon as, you know, we start talking, he says, "Are you studying?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "How hard are you studying?" And I was like, "Yeah, pretty hard, like I'm doing the best I can." And he was like, "That's not good enough, just keep working harder." And then he goes, "Okay, more importantly, are you going to maths?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Every day?" I was like, "Well, no, I'm going once a week." And he's like, "Okay, you need to go every day." And I'm sat there with this guy who's very much dying, you know, and he's just interested in making sure that, like, I've got back on the right trajectory. Like, that was his sole sort of objective.
One day he texted a friend, "I've had a very bad day with pain." And then he added in the same text, "But I have been offering it up for various intentions. Do you have any intentions I can pray for?"
Once we were going to his room and I was carrying some, I think it was food and a bottle of water, but the bottle of water was empty. So I took the things and left them on the desk. And I said, I'm gonna refill the bottle of water. And he said, "No, I'll do it myself later." And I was like, "You can't even walk." At this time, he could walk, but with a lot of difficulty. And he stopped me there and said, "Leave it there, I'll do it myself later."
One of the nights I stayed with him, I woke up in the middle of the night and I heard him sort of trying to get up himself. He said, "Pedro, the whole reason I'm here is to help you out." And he was saying how he didn't want to wake me up because he knew I had to go to work the day after. And at that point, I very rarely saw him cry. Yeah, but he broke down crying, saying, I just don't want to be a nuisance for people.
So one day the doctor came to visit Pedro at home towards the last part of his illness, and essentially the doctor advised him not to exert himself too much, because I think Pedro was trying to do too many things. And then Pedro said, "No, for me this is like a marathon runner. You run the marathon and then you need to take your time to catch your breath." And the doctor said, "Pedro, you are amazing, you are inspirational."
I went into his room and I was a bit fed up. I was like, "Look, all this, Pedro, look, you're young. You're the first you're first person to become a numary, whistles a numary in a long time in England. You're very clever, very sociable. You have such a bright future ahead of you. You know, you're in Imperial College, one of the best universities in the world for chemical engineering. And then you get cancer. And we both know you're probably going to die." I said, "Do you think this is all worth it? God, religion, you being a numary, all this suffering, and then look how God's treating us." You know, I was very angry at God. And then he was lying down, and then he sits up and he sits next to me. He's like, "Come sit down." And then he was like, "Javi, I would go through all this suffering, the chemotherapy, the pain, everything, knowing how many people we have helped."
He told me that he'd been asking, precisely because I think when he became a numary, at some point he realized, I got it great. Yeah, I got a great family. I got very good friends. I'm doing well at school. Yeah, I can't complain. And I've always said that God rewards with the cross. Yeah, that the cross is a sign of the love of God. And he started asking for something that he could offer. So in that conversation, he was saying, I didn't quite expect something like this.
He didn't ask for an illness. He asked for something that he could offer up, I think, because he felt that he'd been very fortunate.
One evening, on a Sunday like that, he was looking at television, and there was nobody there. It was only him and me, because I used to stay with him in the room overnight. And they said, and I started crying. And I said, "Dad, I love everything. I want to know everything." When he knew he was going to die, he would cry because he knew he was not going to be able to intervene in the apostolate in London.
We showed him a photo of one of the new houses of Opus Dei that we were going to open. And I remember that he kind of got very emotional when he saw the photo. And he said to me, "Pablo, man, it's just really hard because there are so many things that are going to happen, and I've realized I'm not going to see them."
Family invited me to come to the UK, and I came to Manchester to see them. I was with him and the family for 2-3 days. He asked for a conversation in private, and we were sitting here in the garden. He spoke about his death. I saw the clarity and his readiness. Well, he said that he's prepared to go, that others will come to fill the gap. You know, and imagine, I mean, he was a young fellow of 21 years. I was so much impressed, I mean, especially about his readiness. Huh? I felt this young fellow is really ready to die.
The last time I saw him, and we were left alone in the sitting room of the family house, he said to me, I'm not afraid. And that told me everything about his spiritual life.
Pedro finished his course of chemotherapy just before the summer of 2017, and he had this course that he was due to take place in Holland, and he was essentially very much looking forward to going there and enjoying his time with the other young people. And also he was very excited because the prelate of Opus Dei was going to be there for maybe a couple of days, and also the vicar of Opus Dei, Mariano Faccio. So our aim was Pedro has to go there no matter what. I sent him with some medication.
He was always smiling. I realized immediately that he didn't want to be a special case. One day, I spent the whole day with him. We spoke about his mates. I realized that he had a very deep apostolic zeal. He was searching always how to help them. In that period, the news about the Middle West and the ISIS were very important, and he studied a lot.
It was very moving at a Christmas dinner where he was given his favourite bottle of whiskey, and his first thought was to share it with others.
Special Reserve. It's a Special Reserve blended Scotch whiskey. Oak age, matured in oak cask, minimum 3 years old.
Yeah!
Hey, everyone. Yes. We'll share this later.
Anyway, I sat down with him and he would sort of fall to sleep sometimes, which is obviously very understandable because he was tired and so on. But anyway, the conversation was fairly natural, and then out of nowhere he asked me, because to give a bit of context, at this time I just joined Opus Dei a few months before. And so he asked me out of nowhere, are you happy with your vocation? And I said, yeah, I'm quite happy. And then he asked me, are your parents happy with your vocation? And I said, I think so. And then he just said, are you happy? And I was like, yeah. And then I asked him, I said, are you happy? And he said, I've never been happier in my life. Which obviously after 3 years of going through cancer is quite a statement, I think. And it struck me, so.
Pedro was in a lot of pain, had to take a lot of strong painkillers, and the doctors trying to introduce a device that goes into the spine to control the pain. So he had that done, and then when he came to the room to rest after that procedure, he started crying. He sort of explained to his mother that it was the first time in about a year that he was in no pain whatsoever.
He phoned me one night, went to his room, and he just said, I think I'm going to die. And at that point, I froze a little bit because I didn't quite know what to say. I think I said, well, we're all going to die, which he sort of smiled and said, yeah, this is what I keep telling myself. But it is really painful. He had the crucifix in his side table. I said, no, I grabbed the crucifix and I'm offering all of this up for the Pope and for the work and for these intentions that people are giving me. And that's where he mentioned, it is the pain, but it's also I want to be well around people, and this doesn't let me, or I'm very tired because I can't sleep more than 10-15 minutes in one go. Anyway, after a bit of a conversation, and this was very much Pedro, which he just said, okay, I'm calmer now, you can go. Okay.
He couldn't really talk very clearly. I said, well, Pedro, why not we start praying the rosary? And then we started praying the rosary, and at that moment he just hugged me. He gave me a most amazing hug, so strong, very strong. I could still feel all the strength in his hands and in his arms, so strong. And then that was it. That was the last time he moved his hands. From that day, he couldn't move.
In the last week, he lost consciousness. So there in his bedroom, people would come and go. And at one point, I was sitting next to him. And there was another lad. There's me, there's this lad. There in the middle of us is Pedro, unconscious. And this lad says to me, I'm going to become a Catholic. I've decided. Pedro was telling me I need to become a Catholic and I was delaying, but now I'm going to do it.
His grandmother eventually arrived on the night on the 13th of January, or a few minutes after she arrived. His breathing pattern changed and we knew that the end was coming, so we all gathered around him, people in Grega, his family. So the priest came to give him the anointing of the sick.
Yeah, my mom came and we were praying the Salve, which is the Hail Holy Queen.
And at the words of Dionysus of mercy towards us, he essentially gave his last breath. I was at 1:30 a.m.
At the funeral, there were over 500 people, including 30 priests, and it was celebrated by Archbishop Roche, who had travelled specially from Rome.
There were his school pals, there were his university fellow students, there were people from the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, other patients who were receiving treatment for cancer were there. So many people who knew the family and so on.
I had the honour with a few other people of carrying Pedro in. We placed him down and we went to return to our seats. And not that a funeral was particularly a funny experience, but I remember walking around looking for a seat because I couldn't find one. Luckily, my dad had saved me one right at the edge, but this place was absolutely packed. There was people stood up at the back, people stood up in the aisles on the side. You really couldn't have fit more people into this huge place. And I think that just showed the number of people that Pedro had sort of touched and influenced in his life.
You know that that's a very special moment. Because although I was preaching, it was really Pedrito who was preaching to them by his life. We were only giving evidence as to his holiness, as to his deep, humorous humanity, and his patience and his encouragement of other people.
I really understood the impact and the love because okay, we knew people, we moved, we had friends, but we don't know so many people to 600 people to fill the church. It wasn't us. For me, it was actually seeing the impact of his life in many people, and they wanted to travel from Harrogate. It was an hour and a half taking the motorway, just coming for the funeral. For many people, it wasn't easy to travel.
Pedro had a profound priestly soul, uniting everything to the priesthood of Christ, particularly suffering. And I think that's what Pedro did very, very well. And a priestly soul also in the sense of wanting to bring all souls to God.
When they come and they say, you know, that, will you pray for us? And I say, ask Pedrito to pray. So I've got all these cards in many languages and I give them out. And when I write to people personally, not as the prefect, not official letters, but when I write personal letters to people, I put that little prayer in the letter and send it to them. And I think wonderful things are beginning to happen.
Because of Pedro's commitment to chemical engineering, his passion about it, we decided to put forward a case to the exam board to award him a posthumous degree. I was encouraged and supported by colleagues that also knew him, and the exam board approved this request unanimously, and it was a very nice thing to be able to do as a department.
And for the degree of Master of Engineering in Chemical Engineering, awarded posthumously, Pedro Ballesta Arenas.
I saw him, and I said, holiness is somewhat accessible to the average normal person who goes to university, has a normal life, and has a professional career ahead.
Pedro was extraordinary because he was ordinary, and that's really what we need nowadays, especially in the church.
I was asking myself, so what do I do as a Catholic? How can I deepen more into my faith? How can I follow this example of a young fellow who was obviously so much dedicated to his vocation and in following Christ in his vocation?
Well, I think he's an example because of the character of a young man who's so full of life, highly intelligent, who could have had the world at his feet in all sorts of different ways, chose instead to dedicate himself entirely to God. That was his real thirst.
I will always remember Pedro's smile. Pope Francis talks about the joy of the gospel, and Pedro was a physical embodiment really of the joy of the gospel.
A young man, very ill, always happy, always transmitting peace, serenity, for me was a very good example. I am working in a computer with his picture, and every day I pray to him in order to be very serene, very happy, and to live the virtue of fortitude.
During the illness, his heart expanded. He loved so much. He made everybody feel so loved. He has such a deep interest in the person.
He was very faithful, faithful to his friends, faithful to the family, faithful to the work, faithful to me, right? A rock. You know when they talk about St. Peter, I visualize my brother as St. Peter, a rock.
Pedro knew that his life had one purpose, which is to make sure that people met Jesus.
Pedro was my best friend. I'm not religious, but he had a huge impact on my life.
Pedro's taught me and the family how to love, which is just give yourself to others. So if doing this video is going to help other people, I'm happy to say open our family, open Pedro, open give. I mean, Pedro died with 30 people in the room and more than half were not family. You know, something, so he's taught us to give everything, even the death of my brother. So now if this can help, then